Hi all, welcome back to part 2 of my Vega pre-release coverage. Today I will cover some of the more interesting features of the Vega architecture and share my thoughts on them. Note that there has been scant information released by AMD on Vega, only basic high-level details, so a lot of this presentation would just be my interpretation and speculation of these new features. Again, just to remind you, I could be very wrong, so please do not use this presentation as justification for any personal biases. And as always, I encourage you to do your own research for further clarity. Let's start with a basic fact. A graphics chip has a lot of fixed function hardware, often referred to as the front end, back end, or fixed function blocks, and when AMD calls the current architecture GCN, semantics aside, it really only applies to the compute units. AMD refers to Vega's compute units as new compute units or NCU, but don't be fooled, it is still very much GCN, only that it has gained some very useful features. Where Vega is a revolution compared to previous GCN, with major changes to warrant a new architecture name, it actually occurs within the front end and the back end. In the last video, I ended it on the most important change with Vega, suggesting it has a form of tile-based rasterization. Now, a caveat here, GPUs already perform various tiling optimizations already, so let me be very clear. The drawstream binning rasterizer in Vega is not likely to be tile-based rendering as mobile GPUs do it, due to incompatibilities with PC APIs. The same also applies to Nvidia's tiling technique, so while a lot of folks equate Maxwell and Pascal's rendering to real tile-based rendering GPUs, without official info for Nvidia, we simply do not know the extent to which it is implemented. In general, tiling optimizations all have an identical purpose, to improve performance while saving bandwidth and power, and it does this by breaking down the workload into very small fragments. The principle here is to work on smaller sets of data that can be read or write quicker or better, fits within on-GPU cache rather than off-GPU VRAM. When most people think of graphics capabilities of a GPU, they tend to focus on the stream processors or CUDA cores, but graphics first occurs in the front end before primitives even take shape and only exist as code or draw calls. The geometry processor or polymorph engine fetches vertices and executes vertex shaders to generate triangles for the next stage, rasterization to generate pixel information. These pixels are then processed with all manner of pixel shaders to complete the entire frame, then it is sent to the back end or ROPS for output to display. This pipeline is known as immediate mode rendering because each of the vertices are transformed, they get rasterized into a pixel immediately and it's finished before the next primitives gets rasterized. In tile-based rasterization, all of the geometry is processed as a first step, which then gets culled and binned into separate smaller tiles. Each tile is then rasterized to become pixels and proceeds to further stages. As a tile is finished, the next tile proceeds and so on. Once all of the tiles are done, the frame is presented to the display. Now, there's two interesting questions here. One, why do we need to process all the geometry first before tiling? Without geometry data, we simply do not know the location of a primitive to even place it in a tile. The other question is, why do we have to process a tile entirely before moving to the next one? It's all about the on-GPU cache, it's just not big enough. This is obviously a more convoluted approach, so why would it be advantageous at all? During the pixel formation process, steps such as blending, depth testing, and stencil testing requires access to large pixel information datasets, and it has to travel to and from the VRAM. The consequence of this is not only performance limitations due to bandwidth, but also due to increased power usage due to memory controller activity. If bandwidth is a limiting factor, the GPU's design must therefore go with a bigger bus and higher clock VRAM, and both of this leads to higher power usage. By processing smaller tiles instead of the full scene, the data can fit within the on-GPU cache. On-GPU cache is both faster and an order of magnitude lower latency and lower power to utilize. If the GPU used less of the main VRAM and more of its on-chip cache, performance is not as limited by VRAM bandwidth, and so to achieve a certain level of performance, a linear chip with a smaller bus will suffice. Now, remember that tiling techniques can also be used for each step: rasterization, pixel shading, and render backend processing. In a true tile-based rendering architecture, all of these steps happen in sequence. A tile from the front end goes all the way to completion before the next tile is rendered. Nvidia GPUs likely have a mix of traditional immediate mode and tiling optimization for some steps. With Vega, AMD is implementing an improved tiling step for the rasterizer or drawing pixel formation, an important step for today's high-resolution gaming. For all of the aforementioned advantages, why not implement more tiling years ago? There's a few disadvantages to tiling, particularly in the early front-end stages. The first disadvantage is requiring a dedicated tiler and on-chip binning cache, which adds to transistor count and die size. Here, one could argue the performance benefit will outweigh the added die cost, but if bandwidth and power is not a limiting factor, why not just go with a simpler immediate mode rendering? We have to view this in the perspective of a decade ago, as the foundations of current architectures back then were still very light on power usage. They haven't hit the peak power for delivery and also for cooling capabilities. The other important point is that back then the average PC gaming resolution was much lower, and so bandwidth and power was not stressed like today. Thus, it was just easier to continue with immediate mode and raise the bandwidth and power limit as required. The second major disadvantage of tiling occurs after the vertex shader step. The output of geometry processing per vertex data and tiler intermediate state is a large dataset that has to be sent to the VRAM. This dataset is then read during pixel processing, so there's an overhead in terms of VRAM capacity and bandwidth that is paid during these steps. These days, gaming resolution has increased, along with an emphasis on post-effects. The burden on frame buffer bandwidth is much greater than the tiling overhead, so this trade-off makes sense. The third downside of tile-based rasterization is the immense load it places on the geometry engines of a GPU, because it requires the entire scene of vertices to be processed first before rendering steps can proceed. On mobiles and early PC graphics, a typical scene may only have 100,000 triangles, and so basic culling along with brute forcing geometry made tiling possible. These days, a million primitive per viewable location is on the low end, with modern games often have tens of millions, even approaching a staggering 220 million as an example in Deus Ex Mankind Divided. As such, the prerequisites for rasterizer tiling to be successful are very effective hardware geometry setup and culling to rapidly handle hugely complex primitive counts. This requirement was simply not met for current GCN iterations. The reason is of course due to GCN's focus on being a general compute GPU, and this is reflected in its weaker ability to process triangles relative to its shader power. As an example, most GCN GPUs has a fixed 4 geometry engines capable of processing 4 triangles per clock. With Nvidia, ever since Fermi, geometry processing was scaled based on the polymorph engines, with one within each SM or compute units. Typically, a mid-range chip may have 16 polymorph engines, which processes a triangle every other clock, and so the effective rate is twice that of AMD's biggest GCN GPUs, even higher if we factor in clock speeds. But raw throughput itself is simply not enough. The geometry engine has to be smart enough to remove or cull invisible or degenerate primitives to reduce the workload. This particular hardware function is one in which Nvidia has long held an advantage since Fermi, and it's again due to the scalable polymorph engines. Nvidia GPUs have always had a huge advantage in geometry processing benchmarks, both visible and occluded triangles. GCN, meanwhile, does not cull many triangles and relies more on brute force, which can quickly lead to bottlenecks when geometry complexity rises, as with heavy tessellation usage. This hardware design difference also manifests itself in low-resolution benchmarks, where pixel shading becomes lightweight but geometry load remains similar. As a portion of the frame rendering time, geometry processing dominates over other tasks. This factor is why low-resolution benchmarks can be misleading, where reviewers often assume lower AMD GPU performance is due to the mysterious driver overhead. Inversely, AMD GPUs have tended to perform better relative at higher resolutions, and again it's wrongly assumed to be bandwidth or field rate advantages. It is simply due to high resolution shifting the frames load to pixel shading, where GCN's potent stream processor arrays with the high performance flex the power. Let's return to Vega and how the shift to the rasterizer tiling will force its front end to drastically boost geometry processing. AMD claims that Vega's geometry engines have been improved to offer more than 2 times the triangle output. When we look at the footnotes, it specifies Vega is capable of 11 triangles per clock, or 2.6 times the increase. Why are they dialing it to 11? It's an odd number. Either the geometry engines can process 1 or 2 triangles per clock, which with 4 engines results in 4 or 8 triangles per clock. Unless, of course, it's still the same 4 triangles per clock, but with a new primitive shader which replaces the vertex and geometry shader steps. This, in theory, should allow Vega to boost triangle throughput by tapping into its big stream processor arrays to process and cull geometry much faster. Importantly, AMD refers to the primitive shader as a compute shader. As such, it is not far-fetched to suggest parallel dispatching via the asynchronous compute engines. This should, in theory, offload the main graphics command processor for other tasks while the primitive shaders are executing. The major concern is whether this new primitive shader will require specific game coding to access, and there's evidence to suggest both yes and no. Yes, in that direct usage by developers could potentially yield the best performance gains, but no, even if it's not used, AMD can optimize within their drivers on a per application basis. Being a flexible, programmable compute shader gives AMD options to extract higher geometry processing and culling from Vega's new front end. Even if we assume lower than expected gains, an increase in triangles per clock is a significant gain along with improved primitive culling techniques from Polaris. Regardless of whether Vega increases the rate of triangles per clock from 4 up to 11, it's also important to remember that it's per clock and so clock speeds matter. For Vega, AMD is very vague during the teaser, saying that the NCU is optimized for higher clock speeds and higher IPC. Let's cover clock speeds first. Unlike Polaris, where I had to guess its clock speeds, mostly based on Glofo's claims about its 14nm FinFET node, I had guessed it would be 1.5 GHz, which was wrong when Polaris launched last year at around 1.25 GHz. Since the recent Polaris refresh with the RX 580s, with many models at 1.4 GHz and above, it's clear that the initial claims from Glofo about their node was off the mark and they needed time to fine-tune the process to hit their performance claims. With Vega, we have more concrete information on clock speeds directly from AMD. The Vega-powered Radeon Instinct MI25 specs list 25 teraflops of FP16 performance, which equates to 12.5 teraflops of FP32. With the engineering sample of Vega from various leaks and device ID specifications in Linux drivers, we know it has 4096 stream processors. As it's a HPC card to operate at the rated teraflops, that would have to be from its base clocks. Therefore, MI25 would have a base clocks of approximately 1525 MHz to achieve its rated compute performance. How high would the boost clocks be? We simply do not know, but it is obviously configurable based on the card's TDP limits. What we do know is that historically, AMD's professional GPUs were downclocked compared to the consumer variant. There's evidence to suggest MI25 has a rated TDP of 225 watts for better HPC compatibility. This is still low enough for consumer Vega to have a higher clock. My guess is that the high-powered consumer Vega would be around 1.6 GHz base clocks, with variable boost clocks from there onwards towards a peak of around 1.8 GHz. Some of you would think that's too high given what you know about GCN, and I say to you, ditch what you know since it does not apply. GCN, since its debut, the core design has not changed much. There's been no emphasis on redesigning to operate at higher frequencies. As an example, the first GCN, Tahiti, had a peak clock of around 1.2 GHz when overclocked. Later GCN iterations such as Hawaii, Tonga, and Fiji have this same peak. Polaris is clocked higher purely due to the benefits of 14nm FinFETs when compared to the previous GCN on 28nm. Vega being designed for higher clocks tells me one thing, that Vega has a longer pipeline. The trade-off here would be in latency as well as more register and cache usage, but this is mostly offset by the high performance. As for the increased IPC, don't count it anywhere near the 2x increase. AMD is referring to specific use cases such as rapid pack maths to accelerate certain operations. The next Vega feature is the new hardware scheduler, now with a cooler name, the Intelligent Workgroup Distributor. Almost every single reviewer glossed over it with the same load balancing to better utilize resources non-statement. My guess? 2 potential improvements. The first is the simplest, and it relates to scaling performance. As you may know, GCN was originally designed with the capability to scale up to a max of 4 shader engines. A shader engine is similar to Nvidia's graphics processing clusters, a group of fixed function units along with compute units and the arrays of stream processors. Tahiti and Tonga GCN has 4 shader engines each with 512 stream processors. Hawaii, a very capable chip, also has 4 shader engines each with 704 stream processors. These GPUs were considered balanced, performance scaled relative to the stream processors, so there's no work distribution bottlenecks. Fiji, however, also have 4 shader engines, but each has 1024 stream processors, and unsurprisingly, it resulted in underutilization, certainly in DirectX 11 where the ACEs cannot participate to distribute work. Vega has the same stream processor count, and if it's distributed over 4 shader engines, the depth would make for the old scheduler being bottlenecked again. As such, an improved scheduler is required to fully tap into the stream processors to allow Vega to scale performance properly. The other point relates to something very few people talk about, that GCN was designed from the start to break up the scene space into quadrants to match its four geometry engines. Yes, GCN actually already used a form of synchronized screen tiling for rasterization. This, however, is not to the same extent as Vega, as the current approach is not about saving bandwidth or power, as the tile partitions are too big. It is more about work distribution to the four separate shader engines. There's a potential flaw with this approach, however, because not all quadrants of a scene is equal in geometry complexity. With static partitioning, the four rasterizers in GCN may end up with very uneven workloads, and so one may finish ahead of the others, which causes idled or bottleneck rasterizers. A simplified example, imagine your typical first-person shooter. During intense firefights, huge explosions go off on one side of the screen. Your frame rate drops due to all the new transparent smoke particles and effects. When you analyze the scene, the increase in primitive and pixel complexity is there, but it's not overwhelming or should not be given the capabilities of your powerful GPU. But divide that power by 4 and suddenly there is more potential for these bottlenecks to occur. What's happening is some of the rasterizers are idling, while the one that's processing those explosions is now slowing down due to the increased quadrant complexity. With more coherency between the shader engines, the intelligent workgroup distributor is able to spread the load more evenly to prevent individual geometry engines bottlenecking. The other big feature that AMD claims is revolutionary for Vega is the new High Bandwidth Cache Controller, or HPCC. What's new with the HPCC? Firstly, Vega is capable of addressing 512 terabytes of virtual address space. This in of itself is not a novel development because Nvidia's Pascal GP100 is also capable of this feat. However, it's interesting to note that this feature is absent in lower tier Pascal, and so this could be an advantage for AMD in some HPC markets. The HPCC is also designed so that the HBM2 memory is capable of acting like a true cache, and assets can be streamed in fine-grained from various external sources including RAM, non-volatile memory, and even network storage. GP100 is capable of unified memory operations and can access other GPUs' VRAM as well as system RAM, but I do not know whether it's able to access data directly from other sources like Vega can, as it's not something Nvidia talks about. With AMD's past GPU efforts, they've offered similar or better raw compute performance for less money to these markets, but it has not led to major market penetration. The reason, as I've mentioned, is due to the entrenched nature of CUDA. Companies and institutions are not willing to switch just for similar or a little bit better performance. The cost of GPU accelerators are not a big issue in these markets. It's all about software and being able to do something special that your competitor cannot. Realistic real-time renders of high-resolution scenes uses hundreds of gigabytes of assets, and this is why they are restricted to CPU clusters with large system RAM capacity. Vega, in my opinion, would dominate this kind of large dataset acceleration. In fact, it's something the HPC market has often demanded for GPU accelerators to remove the shackle of its limited VRAM capacity, as they are simply too small for the world of big data. An interesting thing to watch out for is how Vega relates to AMD's Zen architecture, as Zen focuses on efficiency and it lacks the performance on more intensive AVX instructions, some of which the HPC markets needs. These instructions also happen to run very well on GPUs, but their use is often restricted to CPU clusters, again due to limitations in software as well as the GPU's VRAM capacity. It's going to take effort from AMD's part, but I think they will have an excellent synergy with Zen Naples and Vega Instinct, which could penetrate into this HPC niche. Moving on, the HPCC enables Vega's HBM2 to be more effective in terms of capacity, with AMD quoting a 2x uplift, so 4GB of HBM2 capacity equals 8GB of GDDR5 for game assets. The reason this claim isn't just PR smoke and that it can work as described is due to a special characteristic of HBM2 itself. It's not about bandwidth or access latency, as potentially GDDR5X and certainly 6X will match HBM2 twin stacks on these metrics. In order to do what AMD claims, fine-grained data streaming into memory as the GPU is processing data on it, constant read and write activations of the banks of memory is required. Think of the banks in your memory chips as individual storage cells which has to be activated to read or write. Activation and access of that data is relatively similar in terms of latency for GDDR5 and HBM2, but with GDDR5, once the banks have been activated, they enter a wait stage or cooldown timer before they can reactivate. This wait period, called Time for Bank Activation Window or TFAW, can be as long or longer than the time it takes for data to be read or write. This is not an issue for current VRAM use. Most game assets are loaded into the VRAM, then the GPU reads it as needed. There's very little consecutive read-write cycles to the same banks. When VRAM is designed to be used like a cache, it needs to handle rapid read-write cycles into the same banks as data that's no longer required has to be evicted and replaced with new data streaming in. Delays due to wait states would likely result in a drop in performance or a frame stutter. This feature isn't new though. VG also has these capabilities. With driver tuning, Fury X with only 4GB of HBM is able to cope with games at 4K resolution that need 6 or 8GB of assets. Remember the Radeon Pro SSG? It's VG with an M2 SSD on board to handle large datasets. The improvement in Vega's ability, I think, is down to, as AMD said, fine-grained data movement. VG could use its HBM as a cache, but I suspect it evicts and streams in larger chunks, which is fine for games or 8K video encoding, but it may suffer in some scientific workloads. This feature though, while AMD is sold for games, is very much a HPC functionality. For gaming, I suspect it would be a tough sell for a 4GB Vega, even if AMD talks up its cache abilities. There is an advantage the HBM2 offers for gamers, and it's down to power and die size savings. HBM2 moves a portion of the memory controller to the first cell in each stack, so the on-GPU part can be smaller, freeing up space for other features to enhance performance. Power-wise, my guess is that 8GB of HBM2 saves around 20 watts. It's not much, but that's around 10% more performance per watt when it comes to high-end GPUs. A big change that I am excited about with Vega is Rapid Pack Math, or 2 FP16 operations per cycle. And while most have focused on its advantages for HPC, in particular AI deep training, I'm excited for its potential in gaming. Games currently use the standard FP32 format for all of its shaders, but there are many effects which do not need this level of accuracy and will work fine with FP16. Now, the game is not going to suddenly run twice as fast, but the specific effects, which often incurs large performance penalties, can indeed run twice as fast. You may think it's not going to be a big deal because most GPUs on the PC will be crippled with FP16 shaders. You would be partially right. All of Nvidia's consumer GPUs emulate FP16, often at very low rates, so if game developers use FP16 shaders, they would have to also include a fallback to regular FP32 shaders for these GPUs. AMD's recent GCN GPUs can handle FP16 at full speed, so there's more flexibility here, but the dominant market share belongs to Nvidia. As such, FP16 adoption would be minimal, in theory. In practice, in the next few years, what we will see is that there's a big push from game studios towards FP16 shaders. These consoles have around 4 and 6 teraflop GPUs, but gamers demand fluid 4K gaming, and so developers must come up with better optimizations to extract more performance out of the hardware. By switching to FP16 shaders, suddenly the PS4 Pro has over 8 teraflops. This is definitely going to be the path towards 4K 60 frames per second on high settings for these consoles. Of course, you could argue as I have that Nvidia can sponsor the PC port and remove the FP16 shaders. It's not only possible, it makes the most tactical sense for Nvidia to slow down FP16 adoption on PC gaming as it only benefits AMD. But here's where AMD can fight back. Game studios want more performance out of the consoles, and AMD engineers can be vital in the shift to FP16 within the game engines. AMD just needs to reach out, promote, and help game studios to achieve this, and they will reciprocate and include FP16 along with FP32 shaders when they release the games on the PC. Is it a coincidence that Polaris was modified for fast FP16 performance for the consoles? It is no coincidence, and AMD stands to gain from this, but they need to push quickly, seeding the engineers and form partnerships with major game studios to take advantage of the potentially huge performance gains. Think of it like untapped power reserves within Vega. And if fine wine is used to describe GCN longevity or future-proofing, Vega takes this to the next level as it becomes a 25 plus teraflops gaming monster. However, a counterpoint to this, in the longer term, what is stopping Nvidia's consumer Volta from offering 2x FP16 performance? Money. Nvidia loves to segment the GPUs for consumer versus HPC by neutering these unique capabilities, whether it's FP64 or FP16 performance. Nvidia is unlikely to offer twice the FP16 performance on consumer GPUs because it has the potential to cannibalize the Tesla sales. As such, I think gaming FP16 is potentially AMD's advantage for the next few years, at least until the next Nvidia architecture beyond Volta. The last major change in Vega is the shift to coherent pixel and texture memory where the render backends become a client of the large L2 cache. In game engines that use render to texture or deferred shading, this is a performance and power efficiency gain. Most modern game engines are actually deferred, so this change is much needed for gaming and in particular for VR performance. The real interesting stuff about this change is in a slide which AMD didn't talk much about. Look at the Infinity Fabric linking Vega directly from its L2 cache to external CPU and PCI. This has major implications for HPC and HSA performance, though that's not the scope of this video and it's gone on long enough. In summary, Vega should be a leap forward in GCN efficiency, both in terms of performance per millimeter square and also performance per watt. Vega will clock higher, have better geometry and pixel culling and throughput, higher streaming processor utilization, and it also focuses on HPC performance. We know that Vega is approximately 10 to 15% larger than Pascal GP102, which powers the 1080 Ti and Titan XP. With all of its architecture improvements, Vega has a very good chance to take the lead, but ultimately it's going to come down to whether AMD's driver team is able to tap into this new architecture on launch. Because it is a major change, performance is even more reliant on optimized drivers, so let's hope for the best for competition's sake, but since it's AMD, expect an average launch with future drivers to lift Vega's performance. Finally, price-wise, there's a few things which makes me believe Vega is not going to be priced at ridiculous levels. In particular, it's limited to only 2 stacks of HBM2, and the talk from AMD on cost pressures and their desire to regain market share. For gamers, Vega can only disrupt the GPU market and regain market share if it offers exceptional bang for buck, very much like Ryzen trading blows with Intel 6900K at half the price. So feel free to get hyped, but also wish AMD's driver team well, because as great as hardware is, without good software it can be a dud. These videos take me much longer than I expected, so apologies for the abrupt ending last time. Hopefully it has been insightful for you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.